Welcome to our very first conversation and our very first guest on our very first conversation. And our guest this morning is Chris Sandel, who's a nutritionist. His business is 7health.com, and later on in the program we'll be able to explain exactly how you can find Chris should you need him. We follow Chris and his writings and his podcasts. We think they're absolutely excellent. He's got a way with words, and he's got a way of describing really difficult and complex processes in a way that's really accessible. So we always listen in, and we recommend you do too, guys. It's a real pleasure to welcome you, Chris. Hi.
Hi, thank you. And I'm really excited to have this chat with you guys today.
Yeah, brilliant to have you here, Chris. So I guess firstly, tell us a bit about yourself. How did you get this fascinating area we're all in?
Okay, so I'm originally from Sydney, Australia. I moved over to the UK coming up 13 years now. So when I was 21, I finished school, did a business degree, finished that, and was like, I have no idea what I want to do. So I thought I'd do a bit of traveling for a couple of years, work it out, and then move back home. Came over to the UK and instantly moved in with some friends who I'd met before moving over here. And one of the girls in the couple was doing a detox at the time. And so I'd been over here probably 5 or 6 weeks at that stage. And I'm a guy who is very naturally thin. I'd never thought about food in really any form at all. Prior to that experience, I used to have a pretty terrible diet when I was at university. I'd be eating lots of KFC and McDonald's and kebabs, and just didn't really care because I never seemed to put on weight, and that was the only connection I ever made between food and when you would really want to be careful about what you're eating. But I did have really terrible skin, and I had pretty bad acne for, it would have been on and off about 3 or 4 years. And I would go to the doctor, get some antibiotics. It would clear up after 2 or 3 months. As soon as that course of antibiotics would finish, within a short space of time, it would come back. And it just was going on and off like that for about 3-4 years. And so when the person said, let's do a detox, or do you want to do this with me? It was really for that reason, just to see what happened with my skin. And so I followed the detox. I mean, look, I will also say that I don't recommend people do detoxes these days. And it's not something I do myself anymore. But in the whole scheme of things, it was a pretty reasonable and unrestricted detox in comparison to what is often on the menu today. So it was largely a vegan diet that then just couldn't have, I think you couldn't add oils to your food. You couldn't have sugar. You couldn't have salt. There were a couple of other things. So it was mostly fruits, vegetables, beans, pulses, brown rice, that kind of thing. But there was no cap on how much you could eat, and you could eat as much as you wanted. And so I did that for 4 weeks, and I really noticed and improved my skin. And afterwards, I probably just, I could never then cut that connection that I then started to make between my health and what happened with my skin, and then the foods that I was eating. And what actually was beneficial as part of that detox long term for me was it meant that I started to include more and more foods in my diet that I wouldn't have before. So I was having more vegetables, I was having more variety that I hadn't been having before. And so I think it was quite a positive thing. And I just found that from that experience, I would start to read a little bit more about nutrition, became a little bit more interested in it. And over the next couple of years, I'd swing between what you would associate with a young 21-year-old who's just moved overseas and is in London for the first time, so going out and drinking and not looking after myself particularly well, through to like really looking after myself and eating better food and seeing what the difference was. And at some point, after probably annoying people for a very long time, talking about nutrition, bringing it up at parties, that kind of thing, I had some moment, I don't know what set it off, of just like, this is probably something that I want to pursue. And so I looked into different courses and ended up studying at the College of Naturopathic Nutrition, or College of Naturopathic Medicine, sorry, called CNM in London, and studied there between 2006 and 2008, and then finished that course. And then in 2009, I set up my own practice called 7 Health, and then since then have just been building up and starting to work with clients, and that has obviously changed throughout the years, which we can chat about. But yeah, that was really how I got my start with things.
Yeah, so you actually, because you've actually moved out of London since, haven't you? And kind of you have, like you said, changed things up a little bit with what you're trying to do, and probably the types of people, I guess, that you're helping now.
Yeah, so about 3 and a bit years ago, I moved out of London and moved to Kent, and I now live in the countryside. So I've been seeing a girl then for about 2 years, and we're still together. It's like 5 and a bit years now, and both of us by that stage have been in London about 10 years, and it just had a bit of a shelf life, and we were both wanting to be and getting outdoors more. We got a dog, and so I was spending so much of my weekends then going to Epping Forest. And we just, I mean, she was having a bit of health problems at the time, and we just wanted to move somewhere where it was a different pace of life. And we just weren't using London in the way that we had before. We weren't going out late nights. We weren't eating out the way that we had previously. And so the idea of having some more like me time and being in more greenery and everything really appealed to us. And I would have to say, has been one of the best things I've ever done. I really love living out in the countryside. I'm a pretty healthy guy anyway, but I know that moving out here has really helped.
Yeah.
And over that time, my business really started to transition, and I had a couple of practices that I was working out of in London that I then just closed up because I was doing more and more of this stuff online. More of my clients were based in other parts of the world, so US, Australia, Canada, Germany, etc. And so it just didn't make sense for me to be having a place in London where I'd be paying, going, seeing one person in real life, and then doing the rest of it online. So it works really well. I'm able to work from home all the time, and yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and it's the same thing for us actually,
Yeah.
and yeah, it just makes it so much easier and less wasted time in travelling between appointments. So it's fantastic.
Yeah.
One thing I wanted to in particular talk to you about then is obviously there's been a lot of information in the media that confuses people, and for a long time
Yeah.
as well, people have had this idea that fat is bad for them. And I think now they're kind of starting to realise that it's the type of fat that's important. Um, but obviously now sugar and carbohydrates are now in the limelight, and there's a lot of carb dieters around. But certainly everyone seems to be agreed that sugar is evil and the devil.
Yeah.
And I just wondered really what your thoughts were on that. And you can kind of talk about it as carbohydrates as a whole and sugar in particular, if you wouldn't mind.
Okay, cool. Well, look, I will start with carbohydrates. And what I will say off the bat is I don't think there is anything inherently wrong with a low carbohydrate diet if it works for that person and is supportive of health. My issue with it is that it is often talked about as this panacea to fantastic health. And if everyone just goes on a low carbohydrate diet, the same way as in the 80s it was talked about if everyone goes on a low fat diet, that your health is just going to be fantastic and this is the thing you just need to worry about. And realistically, that's not the case. So the three different macronutrients, carbohydrates, protein, and fat, are all important for health. They all have different roles to play within the body and are used for different things. If we're focusing just on carbohydrates, carbohydrates in a lot of ways are your body's preferred energy source. Yes, you can use fat as an energy source, and different organs and different systems will have their preferences, but typically your body's best source of energy is coming from carbohydrates. And this is definitely the case as someone's activities levels start to increase. So the more exercise someone does, but also just the intensity of someone's thoughts and how much their day to day is quite intense or stressful. And I use stressful in the real broad sense that term really relates to. So there's a great bit of research done that was in Robert Sapolsky's Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers, which
Hmm.
is a fantastic book, which I love. And he talked about chess grandmasters. And in the midst of a game, chess grandmasters will go through between 6,000 and 7,000 calories a day just putting little bits of wood in different places on a board, just from
So
thinking,
interesting.
strategizing, etc.
Yeah.
And your brain uses up huge amounts of glucose, which is carbohydrates. So depending on the demands that someone has, not just from physical demands, but also from the mental demands, will determine how much of a need for carbohydrates someone has. If we're getting a little technical on it, when you produce energy, you produce, and I'm talking about producing energy at the cell level, you start to produce other substances as well. And one of those other substances is a thing called carbon dioxide. And most people know of carbon dioxide as this waste product that doesn't have much value. You blow it out and you get it out and then you exchange oxygen, but that's not the case. Carbon dioxide is really important for the way that our cells function and the way that our body functions. And when you produce energy from carbohydrates versus from fat, you actually produce much more carbon dioxide. So there's a whole host of different reasons that mean that carbohydrates is a really important thing for someone to be taking in, and that it then helps them to function, to have better energy, to sleep better, for a whole host of different things. And I think one of the big draw cards for people with carbohydrates is the connection between, if I lose weight, I'm then doing something healthier. And so when someone goes on a lower carbohydrate diet, they will typically lose weight in the beginning. And this is for two main reasons. The first is, often when that happens, calories come down naturally. Someone doesn't have to intentionally do it, just because there's a little bit more boredom with food because you've cut out a whole food group, so people naturally eat less. So that can be part of the reason why there's some initial weight loss. But the bigger reason normally is because you start to use up your glycogen stores. And so glycogen is a form of carbohydrates, or a form of energy that you store to use between meals or in emergencies. So when you eat carbohydrates, some of it is broken down and used immediately, and then some of it is stored as glycogen that gets stored in your liver, in your muscles, a little bit in your blood, and that gets used when you then need that between meals or with emergencies. When you go on a really low carbohydrate diet, you then start to deplete all of your glycogen stores. And as part of storing glycogen, you also store water at the same time. I don't remember off the top of my head what the exact figure is, but it's basically for every gram of glycogen, there's 4 grams of water or something along those lines. So when you start to then deplete your glycogen stores, you also then start to lose a lot of water weight as well. So that's why when you then stand on the scales, it looks like you've had this huge amount of weight loss. And equally, it's when then someone goes from a very low carbohydrate diet to then eating more carbohydrates again in a very short space of time, they can put on some weight, which again is just those glycogen stores being rebuilt, refilled, and also that water weight. So I think that's part of the reason why low carb diets get this really great rap about why they're so good or why they're so healthy, but it's not really true if we're looking in the whole scheme of things, and people are starting to focus on how do I feel, and how do I feel also not just in the short term but the long term. Because the other thing I find with low carbohydrate diet specifically is there's this real honeymoon period where for the first 6 months, 9 months, even a year, sometimes a little longer, people feel like, wow, like I have finally found like the thing that I was after. I feel so good on this. And then that starts to crumble. And a lot of that starts to crumble because you've typically been using more of your stress hormones to really prop up the body to keep that energy going in. Matt Stone describes it as the catecholamine honeymoon, which is what often then starts to then go awry with people. So catecholamines are some of your stress hormones. And so after that initial honeymoon period of this is amazing, I'm so happy I found this, people start to start the old symptoms they used to get start to come back. And the unfortunate thing is, in this situation, people then start to double down. So it's like low carb worked before, now I need to go even lower. And it just makes things even worse and worse. So yeah, I mean, look, I'm not the biggest advocate of low carb diets, especially not as a blanket advice. If it works for someone, then people can do it. But typically what I find is for most people, especially in this day and age when there is a lot of stress and there is a lot of things that people are trying to accomplish in their day-to-day life, that a low carb diet isn't really the answer for them. And so then in your question in regards to sugar, I mean, the thing about sugar, it is like villain number one that we talk about as this thing that's causing this real problem for us. And it's not quite as straightforward as this. Like, yes, I think there can be issues with people consuming sugar if it is making up quite a large percentage of their diet. And the reason I think it can then be problematic most of the time isn't the sugar per se, it's the opportunity cost. And what I mean by that, it's the opportunity cost of the foods that then someone misses out on because they've eaten that sugar. So
Yeah.
instead of having that sugar, they could have had a banana, they could have had some other vegetables, they could have had some meat or whatever it may be. And so it's the missing out of those other nutrients that then cause more of a problem. There's been some really great research done into sugar consumption. Now, if you look at sugar consumption in the US, and I think it's over the last 10 to 15 years, I can't remember what the first and last data is, but it's a pretty long time. And despite what the media is saying about how much sugar we're now consuming, the US have actually dropped down really significantly in how much they consume, something by like 20%.
Yeah.
And this is during the same time that obesity rates and weight has continued to go up. So the idea that it's just sugar and that this is the thing that's causing the problem isn't true. You also have a thing called the Australian paradox, where from the 1970s, I think it is, up to present day, sugar intake has then dropped down, and again, quite significantly. And again, weight has gone up during that time. So the problem with so much of the health is we want these very simple answers. We want this one thing that if people can do, or these two things if people can change, that everything will be repaired. And it is by no means that easy. So yes, sugar can be a problem in the right context. Sugar can also be fine in the right context. And so that's something I'm always trying to instill in people, whether it's through my podcast or when working with clients, is context is everything with this stuff.
Absolutely. And I think, you're totally spot on. When people think of sugar, obviously they do think of the white stuff, but then you've got this kind of big campaigns going on all around different health blogs where they do these lovely videos with the number of teaspoons of sugar equivalent to, say, a glass of orange juice or a banana or a cup of yogurt, and seems to be sort of missing the point a little bit about real foods, and that sugar in and of itself is a substance, and yes, of course, we have the refined sugar, but that doesn't necessarily mean that even if you were to say, look, I'm not going to consume added sugar because it doesn't do anything for me personally, that the sugar in all of these foods, that must mean those foods are terrible, and I think they draw on some conclusions there that naturally make sense to people when they have a certain idea about food, and then I think obviously that potentially can become something people hold on to as an idea, can't it, because it seems so straightforward.
It is, and a lot of the link that people talk about is the link between sugar and diabetes, and that a lot of people get the idea that maybe carbohydrates aren't so bad for people, but if you've got diabetes, you really want to keep it low. And that's also pretty misleading. And there are lots of different factors that go into why someone develops diabetes, and it can happen for different reasons depending on different people. But the simple explanation of it's just sugar's fault isn't true. I mean, there's I can't remember which population they studied, one of the tribes where in the a certain season within the year, a huge amount of their calories, something like 60 or 70% of their daily calories came straight from honey, just because that was around at that stage. So you're talking about people who are eating tons of refined sugar as part of their daily calorie intake. And if the idea is that if you eat that, you then get diabetes, then you should have seen huge amounts of diabetes in those populations, and it just doesn't happen. And so, again, if you look at populations, like it should be that as carbohydrates go up, the likelihood of people getting more and more diabetes also goes up. And again, it doesn't happen. So there's lots of other factors that then need to come into play for that to become an issue. And again, people need to really be keeping this stuff in mind.
Yeah, absolutely. If it's nothing, it's not complicated. It is complicated rather.
Yes.
So yeah, I totally agree with you there. There's always so many other factors, and least to say, stress is always a big part of all of these things, isn't it? Having a very complex relationship with our desire to eat sugar in the first place.
I mean, one of the things that I'd like to just chip in on there is actually nothing technical and everything common sense, which is the easiest way to overeat sugar. I mean, there's an opinion that and a very valid opinion, that sugar in itself is not harmful. It's the excess of it that is actually damaging. And one of the things that we spend a lot of time talking about, and we do quite a lot of talks and presentations, we say to people, you know, the quickest way to control your fear of sugar is to stop eating processed foods, because it's very difficult. You have to consciously overeat on sugar to be able to, you know, to eat the volume that you'd need to eat to, you know, to cause problems. So, you know, as a chef, my biggest mission, if you like, is to get people to really reconnect with whole food and understand that actually it's the processed foods that we do not understand. A, what's in the ingredients, B, what's in the manufacturing process, and are seduced by the advertising and the marketing and some of the components in them make them delicious, so that we want more, and they become addictive, and people, like, the scales fall from their eyes. But then of course the next problem is, well, how do I make time to cook? So there's a lot of work to be done, isn't there, really, in trying to change and shift people's perceptions away from we can rely on other people to feed us, to we need to learn how to feed ourselves, you know, how to nourish ourselves.
Yeah, and I guess that also then comes down to the individual and how much time that person has. And one thing I do find, and I try and rally against, is there can be a real elitist type of rhetoric when it comes to nutrition. And there's a real big difference between someone who is in a good, comfortable position, who can have the time to cook, who can go out and buy fresh ingredients, versus someone who is really living in poverty, who's doing 3 or 4 jobs and all of that. So I think there needs to be that distinction. But from what you said also, in regards to sugar, a lot of the issues around it is to do with, as you said, high reward, high palatability food. Because no one sits down and just eats tablespoons of sugar. Like,
I always say that.
You wouldn't do it. Like after like 2 or 3, you're like, my God, I don't want to do this. But when you then can put that together with different fats and different additives and stuff, it then really starts to light up the pleasure centers in the brain. And what happens as part of that is the point at which you reach the, oh, I'm full, is much higher than without that food. And also, for most people, they have a normal weight set point that you'll float in between. And this is roughly about 10% of your body weight. You'll move up and down within that range, but very difficult for you to move out of that on a whole foods diet. But the more of the processed foods that you're having, and they don't understand why this happens, is it allows you to move out of that weight set point and to have that weight set point actually increase. So I think that's where sugar becomes problematic. But again, it's not the sugar per se, it's the sugar that is then put in, the same way as like the fat can be problematic in that situation as well. It's not the fat per se, but it's when it's mixed with all of these different things that you then get this real problem.
And actually that's quite a nice introduction into, you know, the next question that we have for you, Chris, which and this is a subject that we would like to get much more knowledgeable about, and you know, see where this fits with our practice and our clients. And that's this whole thing around intuitive eating. And I mean, intuitive eating is actually quite intuitive, which is it's well named, and you know, the concept is that we've lost our power to understand naturally what we're eating and to listen to our bodies and to hear what they're saying. And it's a fascinating subject, and I know it's one that's sort of well entrenched in your practice because of the kinds of clients that you work with. So could you tell us what your take is and what you understand by it and how you use it?
Yeah, sure. So intuitive eating is basically getting back to listening to your body about what foods work best for you, what foods you shouldn't be having when you are really hungry, when you are really full, and starting to follow those instincts. And what I would say, for a lot of people, they don't need to do intuitive eating. And the reason for that is their relationship with food hasn't been messed up by years and years of dieting. So if you've never dieted before, you're in relatively good health, you eat what you want, you do most of your own cooking, you don't even need to think about intuitive eating. Like, just do what you're doing, it's working for you. It becomes something that is important for someone, almost like a stepping stone to get them back to being what I would put in like air quotes as a normal eater. And so the idea is to get rid of all of the arbitrary rules that people have around this is a good food or this is a bad food, or I should be having 6 meals a day, or I should be doing intermittent fasting, or whatever it may be, in terms of these arbitrary rules and regulations that people have heard because of different diets and what different gurus or different blog posts have told them to do. And starting to then get in tune with what foods do and don't support my body. What do I feel better on? What happens when I go 6 hours between a meal versus when I have something every 3 hours? What breakfast makes me feel good? What breakfast keeps me going? And so starting to use those feedback from the body of what they want to be eating and what works for them, and also starting to use your hunger and desire for certain foods, as opposed to like having this strict regime of I have to eat this and I can't eat that. And so getting people to be like, you know what, I fancy that, so going for those foods. And I think initially the real fear that people have when they hear this is, if I'm allowed to eat whatever I want, then all I'm going to eat is burgers and pizza and chocolate all the time. That's not actually the case. The reason that people have a real strong desire for that stuff is that there's the novelty factor, because they told themselves they aren't allowed it. What happens is the more and more people eat that stuff, when there is the availability of all these other foods and that they can cook other foods, etc., after a while you start to feel pretty terrible on those foods. And so rather than having to tell yourself not to eat them from a moral standpoint or a judgment standpoint, you just realize that, you know what, having ice cream for breakfast doesn't really work for me. But when I have some eggs and some fruit, I feel better. And so it is really getting away from a lot of the moralizing of food choices and like the destructive nature that that has, and also for people taking the whole health thing way too far and be like,
Yeah.
but this study shows this and I read this and this
Yeah.
says that, and having that be like really paralyzing, where they're trying to make food choices when they follow that stuff, it doesn't work for them, but they just keep it up. So it's really finding that sweet spot between using health knowledge and then using intuition in terms of what supports someone's body, and bringing those two together so that they can get better health.
And increasingly, we're hearing this concept of orthorexia, where people are getting so
Yeah,
hung up about the nutritional benefits of a particular nutrient that
yeah.
they can't see the wood for the trees. And you must see quite a few of those kinds of folks in your practice.
I do, and I do. It is something that's becoming more and more common, and I'll be interested to see what happens. I mean, within psychiatry, I think it is, or psychology. I think psychology. Sorry, psychiatry is the one with the medication. Psychology. They have a big book called the DSM. I can't remember what edition they're up to. It's like 4 or 5,
Yeah.
and certain conditions then get put in that, and that means that someone can only be diagnosed based on what's in that book. And I think there's been a real call for people to have orthorexia added into the next edition. And orthorexia is basically a a preoccupation with clean eating, and using the word clean in inverted commas because it can really mean different things for different people, and a real fear of when they step outside of those boundaries of what they deem to be safe and clean. And I know for a lot of people, this can be a really hard concept to get their head around. Because if you're coming from a place where all you see in the media is everyone's overweight, everyone's obese, everyone needs to be eating better, and then you hear this concept of people have problems because they're eating too much healthy food, people just like, I don't get it. It's just a made up term. It's another thing that people can use to worry about. But the way that I talk about it is, there's a difference between I wash my hands because I'm wanting to be clean, and I wash my hands for 3 or 4 hours a day because I've got OCD.
Mm. Yeah, yeah.
Orthorexia is the equivalent of someone continually washing their hands, where they've taken something that should be a beneficial thing and taken it to the extreme where it starts to cause problems, both from a health perspective, from a mental, emotional perspective, in terms of their life, their relationship, etc. So it is a real issue. And it is something that I then use something like intuitive eating to then be able to deal with, to get someone to be back in tune with their body, to get rid of, as I said before, like arbitrary rules around what foods are okay and what foods aren't.
Mm. And actually, it's quite interesting that, because obviously because of the nature of our work, we're members of a number of different forums, and you know,
Yeah.
we follow the conversations there. We don't always participate, but we do occasionally,
Yeah.
usually to be shot down about the sugar issue. But it's interesting that on a number of the forums, this obsession with you know, what should you be eating, what might you be missing,
Yep.
is becoming more and more prevalent. Have you noticed that?
Yeah,
Kirsty?
definitely. People just want to be perfect, especially people who are parents trying
Parents,
to feed their children.
yeah.
They can't.
Yep.
It's very easy to see how it gets out of hand.
Yeah.
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 And then that doesn't lead to better health. And
No.
that then leads to lots of neurotic behavior. It leads to lots of fear. It leads to people cutting out whole food groups when they don't need to. It can lead down a fairly slippery slope. And there's nothing wrong with someone wanting to eat a little better or to know where their food comes from. I've got no issues with that. But as I said, there's a big difference between that and then where people often find themselves.
Yeah,
Absolutely.
yeah, absolutely. So, Chris, just to a personally interesting question to me, the whole concept of intuitive eating. How would it sit with someone who'd got really, you know, profound digestive distress, digestive health issues?
Yeah.
How can they kind of, you know, navigate that path that they're eating what feels good, but at the same time they're not eating what's going to be, you know, irritating and aggravating to their condition?
Sure. So there's a difference in my mind between someone being given like arbitrary food guidelines and then someone being given prescriptions based on what's the most likely problematic foods or what are going to be the best foods for them to eat based on their health conditions. And that's definitely what I do when I'm working with clients. If they've got some issues that they're trying to deal with, I will make suggestions and say, I think these are going to be better. I think having it in this structure is going to work better for you. But as part of that, it's then you now go out and see how that works for you. Do this for the next 2 weeks and then come back and see. And if they then found that some of those foods are better when they avoid them, then great. If they find that there's certain foods that when they eat them, it helps to improve their digestion, then great. And what should then happen as a natural process as part of that, through intuition, when they're then making decisions about their food, their leaning should be more from that side of things in terms of health. And look, the people I'm working with, they're adults. They can choose to eat and live in whatever way that they want. But if they're thinking about, you know what, I want to have better digestion or I don't want to be having this issue, when they're making that choice of what should I have for lunch, they can then keep that in their mind. And they can decide to eat, say, a big bowl of pasta, even though that they are going to suffer for it later on, and that's fine. But what typically starts to happen is when people discover more and more of the things that genuinely support them, they have more of that naturally appear in their diet.
Yeah, and do you use the concept of a food journal or a food diary? Not as much to help people track what they're actually eating, but we have quite a big section of ours is devoted to how does that make you feel.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So yeah, depending on the clients, I work with a real range of people, and a large section of what I work with is people coming from a disordered eating range of things, or an end of the spectrum. For those people, less likely to be keeping a proper food journal, may get them to record some stuff, but that's definitely on a case by case basis. For people where it's much more straight up nutrition, yes, I get them to keep a food journal, and it's normally 3 to 4 days a week. The caveat with that is that make sure your food journal is representative of how you normally eat. So it's not like, oh God, this is a blowout day, I'm not going to record this one. Because like for me, I don't care. Like there is no judgment. I don't care what someone eats. All I'm trying to do is see what they do and then make suggestions to be able to help them. So I would prefer someone to put their bad days down, because then we can see, how do your bad days really affect you? Do they affect you as badly as you think they do? What are some of the things you can do to mediate that stuff, etc.? But a big part of the food journal is getting people to reconnect with what works for them, what doesn't, how is their energy, what happened in their mood. And I mean, my job, I think, as part of helping someone do this, is really as a guide. and it's starting to help them to see the different patterns that are going on. So we can then look at that food journal, and I'm like, you know what, look at what's happening every afternoon. That's going on. And the reason I think that that's going on is look at your first 2 meals and start to point out that pattern. And so really getting someone to understand this stuff is pretty difficult if you're not doing a food journal. Because if I was to ask most people, like, what did you have for breakfast last Monday? Most people are gonna do a blank. If I ask you what you had to eat yesterday, most people are gonna draw a blank.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
to really get the idea of, okay, well, how often are you having certain foods, or what is the amount of protein you're having coming through the day, or all of these different things without a food journal can be difficult. And the food journal, I always stress to people, isn't just for me, it's for them as well. Like,
Exactly.
so
Yeah.
often clients are like, because I'm doing this, I'm so much more conscious of X, or I'm so much more conscious of Y, or I didn't realize I ate so much of this, or I thought I ate much more of that, or whatever. And so it's not just for me, it then also helps them just to become aware. Because for so many clients, they're on autopilot, they don't even realize.
Yeah.
And that food journal can bring an awareness to what they're eating is really like.
Yeah, and we also find that it's useful to use one even during the process. So it's not just for the initial analysis, but actually to help people see how they've progressed and how their wellness is improved. And it's not just coincidental that, oh, I've been doing this and I feel better for that.
Yeah.
But actually, when you track back and look at the pattern of how your eating has changed and how your feelings, both your body and mentally, emotionally, how that's changed, that's a real, it's quite a strong motivator for people to actually keep on track, isn't it?
Yeah, totally. And I mean, I work with clients for a minimum of 5 months. I don't just we'll do a consult and then maybe I'll see you in 3 or 4 weeks. Let's see what happens. Like, I want to work with people in a specific way where I'm doing a consult with them. It's for an hour every 2 weeks, and we're going to do that for a minimum of 5 months. And so as part of that, I will get them to keep a food log if it's someone I'm working with and it's for purely health and nutrition reasons, where I'm getting them to keep that food log every single week throughout that process. And it is really common that a couple of months in, I'm like, go back and have a look at your logs when we started, because
Yeah.
I think you'll start to notice a real big difference. And it's a really good exercise for people to do, because not only from a food perspective, but also from a symptoms perspective, because
Yeah.
as things get better, it's really easy to forget what they were like.
Yeah,
And so people are like,
absolutely.
oh, things haven't improved that much. I'm like, when we started, you were barely sleeping. Like, within a month, you got your period back. Like, there's all of these different things that start to happen that you've now forgotten about because they've just become the norm. But things have really progressed. And so having something like that in black and white that people can go back to, yeah, it really helps.
Yeah, and actually, you've just mentioned something that's really dear to our hearts. And just briefly, one of the things that we like about your approach is that it's very congruent with our own, and that it isn't just about the food.
Yeah,
We firmly believe that food is your best medicine, but it isn't the only medicine.
yeah,
And things like sleep and good digestion and movement and connection and relationships and all those other things are
yeah,
all part of what I know is very dear to you, is this concept of self-care.
yeah.
And we listened to your podcast yesterday with Jamie Mendel, was it?
Jamie Mendel.
Mendel.
Yeah,
And she, that's what her whole career now is about, to help people understand how self-care is more important than just a bubble bath or the
yes,
odd massage or whatever.
yeah.
So, just very briefly, what does it mean to you to as a holistic, if you like, practitioner? How do you approach those other areas with your clients?
So, I mean, look, as you say, food is just one part of the puzzle, and it is often quite a big part, but it is just one. And so, getting people to realize how all of these other areas impact on their health and why they're then important. And then, as part of that, self care then isn't just about, oh, I'm really stressed, I need to go and get myself a massage, or, oh my God, like, I should just run myself a bubble bath, as you say. It's about what can people be doing day in and day out that are really supporting their body. So it's about the kinds of foods that they eat. It's about them getting to bed on time and getting the number of hours that really works for them. It's about including time doing some exercise or getting outdoors. It's about working on relationships and having good, fulfilling relationships and how important those things are in someone's life. So self-care for me isn't this like really narrow little thing. It's like the really big, all-encompassing part of all of this and how it all ties together. And it's just so much of health just glosses over this stuff, and it's really missed because people want like dramatic changes overnight, and it's normally from a weight perspective, or it's like this, oh, I did this and then 6 weeks later everything was all changed. And that's just not how real health works. And it's about finding things that people can do that are sustainable, that are consistent, that they keep up year after year after year. And that's the thing that makes a difference. Like those tiny little 1% really start to add up. There's a fantastic article on James Clear's blog. James Clear writes a blog, I think it's once or twice a week. I highly recommend it. It's all on habit formation, and a lot of his articles just have great stories and anecdotes. But he looked at the coach of the British cycling team, and I can't remember what the coach's name was, but when he came in, the goal was to take the team in the next 5 years to win the Tour de France, and they actually ended up doing it in 3. And the way that he did it was he just wanted to improve everything they did by 1%. And so the obvious stuff was in terms of food and nutrition and training, but it was like, what pillows can we be providing them with in the hotel room that are going to be better for them? What's the best antibacterial they can be rubbing on their hands? Like all of these tiny little things. And those little marginal gains, day on day, make no difference. After a year, after 2 years, they all add up. And I think people need to keep that concept in mind instead of like, oh, I'm going on holidays in 6 weeks, I need to change everything. It's like, what can I be doing now at age of 30 or 35 that if I keep up by age 40 or 45, I'm going to have noticed some real significant changes in my life. And that long-term approach means that people avoid a lot of the fad stuff, but it also means that people find things that they can keep doing long term, where it's then not about willpower, it's about, this is just how I live my life.
So the healthy habits that people can set, just small changes, make a huge difference at the end of the day. And they're not just changes in and of themselves, they're kind of, the sum is greater than the parts.
Correct.
I think the whole, one's whole being and cognitively and emotionally and physically changes with those kind of multiplicative factors, if you like.
And as part of that stuff as well, it shouldn't be just about the end goal. Like, I'm always getting people to be finding things so that they can enjoy the process. So it's not, oh, I'm putting myself through this, but I'm going to remind myself that in a year or 2 years, things are going to be better. It's like, find things that you genuinely enjoy doing so that if the end goal doesn't turn out the way that you hoped it would, you're not going to feel like shortchanged or feel like ripped off because, oh, it hasn't worked out and I put in all this sweat and tears that I've hated doing it. So find things that you like and enjoy doing, and then like most of the time you can then keep that up much, much easier.
Absolutely. So Chris, what does the future hold for you? Have you got any exciting plans? Have you got what are your plans for for yourself, your life, where you're going with what you're doing? We'd love to know.
Right. So there are lots of hopes and dreams and things that I would like to do. I think at the moment I've been really focusing on my podcast show, which I started about 9 months ago, and so that's taking up a lot of time, but it's been something I really enjoyed doing, and the feedback from it's been great. I'm still continuing to be taking on clients, and as I said earlier on, I work with clients for a period of 5 months as a minimum, and the way I structure that is I have 2 intakes of clients each year, so one at the beginning of the year and then one in the June, July, August time. So focusing more on that. I've previously done a couple of online programs, and I've just been started chatting with someone about doing a program together with her. And so that's something I'm going to probably be focusing on over the next couple of months. I mean, in the very longer term, I would love to start doing retreats or something along those lines, where people can spend a number of days or a week really getting into this stuff and starting to focus on it. And as part of what I do, so much of it has nothing to do with food, and it is really about people's relationships with themselves, body issues, confidence, self-esteem, their sense of purpose, like all of these other areas that I've spent so much time reading on, focusing on, and learning about, because it's that kind of stuff that then becomes the bottleneck for why people can make changes.
I agree.
Because if you worry constantly about your weight, the chances are you're not going to be able to intuitively eat.
No.
Because when your body says, I need X, the thought process will be, but what's that going to do to my weight? And should I be listening to my body, or should I be trying to stick to the plan so that I can slim down, or whatever it may be? And so there is so many of these other factors that then get in the way of someone being able to follow a healthy diet. So if it's only focusing on diet, so much would be then just butting your head up against a wall of like, why can't someone just do this? But if you start to then realize that people have all of these other things going on in their life, and that those need to be looked at alongside it, then it becomes a really different process.
Well, that's absolutely on our page, and we've actually in the past a few times have been asked to work and collaborate with weight loss practitioners or advisors or counsellors, and we've had to refuse, because we say very firmly that you don't lose weight to get healthy, you get healthy to lose weight. And your concept of health should be much broader than what you're putting in your mouth. And it's in its own context, but it's the holistic idea of when I do that, then this will happen, is just not a valid thing.
No.
Yeah. So I think we can we've taken up enough of your time.
Yeah, thank you so much. It's already, I for one look forward to learning more on the intuitive eating topic. I think certainly as a former dieter, I hope I'm getting there myself, but I certainly for clients' benefit, I think it's a really useful topic, and love to explore it more. So
for sure.
Yeah.
Cool. Well, I've done a podcast on intuitive eating that people can listen to. I would also recommend, if people want even more information on it, to check out the book by it's two ladies' names who are escaping me at the moment, but the name of the book is Intuitive Eating. So if you search,
we can put it into our show notes, and actually, if you could just tell people where they can find you and where they can sort of see more of your work. Okay,
sure. So my website is seven-health.com. In terms of Facebook, if you go to 7 as the number health, you'll be able to find me. I'm pretty rubbish on social media apart from Facebook, but Facebook I put a lot of time and effort into. So I'll put out a couple of posts on there, whether it be stuff that I've written or that I've found from other people every day. In terms of my podcast, that is called Real Health Radio. So if you search in iTunes or Stitcher or whatever podcasting you use, you'll be able to find it.
And on your website as well.
You can also find on my website. If you go to my website, there's a tab that has podcast, and that will then bring up all of the different episodes there as well. But yeah, if you're using something like iTunes or whatever, you can then just subscribe, and then the new episode will just come in each week. And I put an episode out every Thursday.
Yeah.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much.
Yeah, and I would just like to recommend that everybody does listen to them, because they're great guys. They're really great. And congratulations, Chris, because you do a fine job with those.
Oh, thank you. That's really lovely to hear.
Oh, you're welcome.
Okay, that's it.
So that's it. So thank you very much, Mr. Sandel. It's been a pleasure. And we hope to catch up soon, and we wish you the very best with what you're doing.
Cheers. Well, look, I've loved speaking to you guys today, so thank you so much for having me on the show.
You're welcome.